Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Travis Carter, and on behalf of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation and New York University, I would like to say welcome to the 2009-2010 Bickle and Brewer NYU International Public Policy Forum Finals Debate. I want to welcome everyone here today. I also want to say a very special hello to those that are watching at home. For the first time ever, we are streaming this finals debate live via the internet. I want to extend a special hello to the families, the friends, and many others in the debate community who are tuning in today. We're glad to be with you live from New York University. Before we introduce our debaters and judges, let's take a moment to set the stage for this finals competition. The IPPF was founded in 2001 by the Bickle and Brewer law firm, and the contest is now jointly administered by Bickle and Brewer Foundation and New York University. When the contest began, it was the only program of its kind in the United States that gave high school students the opportunity to participate in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. Today, the competition has gone global. It involves debaters from around the world. More than 240 high schools, representing 40 states and 31 foreign countries, registered for our 2009-2010 competition. In October, students were asked to submit qualifying round essays on the public policy topic, Resolved: the United Nations should substantially increase humanitarian assistance for persons living in poverty. An essay review committee reviewed all of the papers, determined the top 32 teams, and those 32 teams entered into a single elimination written debate tournament, volleying papers back and forth in the affirmative and the negative. The judges reviewed all of those papers in the order they were presented and voted for the winning school. That process continued for several months and several rounds until we worked our way to the final 8 teams, or the Elite 8, as we like to call them. Those 8 teams traveled to New York this weekend as guests of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation. They earned an all-expenses-paid trip to come here and supplement their past written scholarship with oral advocacy. A series of individual one-on-one oral debates began this morning at 8 a.m. for a panel of judges. Those 8 teams invited to New York included Atlantic Community High School from Delray Beach, Florida, Cherry Creek High School from Greenwood Village, Colorado, Notre Dame High School from Sherman Oaks, California, Henry Clay High School from Lexington, Kentucky, McNeil High School from Austin, Texas, Samuel Marsden Collegiate School from Wellington, New Zealand, Singapore Ministry of Education from Singapore, and Suncoast Community High School from Riviera Beach, Florida. After determining winners in the first 2 rounds of debate this morning, we are down to our final 2 teams who are in this competition. We want to say that following this final debate, we will have a dinner and award ceremony tonight. The winner will earn the Bickle and Brewer Cup, a traveling trophy that resides at the home of the debate champion, and also the Bickle and Brewer Foundation will award the winning school a $10,000 grand prize. Our first finalist team is Henry Clay High School from Lexington, Kentucky. The coach is Axel Lamada, and the 3 debaters here today are Athy Levis, Naya Ray, and Sarah Atkins. A round of applause. Our second final team is from the Ministry of Education in Singapore. The coach is Gaeta Crayfield. The 3 debaters with us this afternoon are Tao Rin Che, Ashish Kumar, and Benjamin Mak Ji Ming. Welcome. And now we'd like to take a brief moment to introduce our moderator and our esteemed panel of judges. Our moderator for today's proceedings is David Baker. David currently serves as the Director of Admissions at the St. Mark's School of Texas. Prior to that, he coached debate and taught public speaking for 16 years. Under his direction, the St. Mark's Debate Program was named one of the top 10 most successful programs of the 20th century. Mr. Baker has been inducted into the National Forensic League Hall of Fame, and he is a longtime friend and partner of this competition. One of our founders, Mr. William Brewer. Mr. Brewer co-founded Bickle and Brewer in 1984, and since that time he has earned a national reputation as one of the most successful attorneys practicing in his field. He's a co-founding partner of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation, and he plays a leading role in the foundation's award-winning educational and community outreach program. A former debater himself, Mr. Brewer now serves on this advisory board. He works very closely with a number of debate associations, and he has previously been named the Communicator of the Year by the National Forensic League. Mr. John Sexton, the 15th president of New York University. He is the Benjamin Butler Professor of Law and NYU Law Dean's Dean Emeritus, having served as Dean of the Law School for 14 years. President Sexton is Chair of the Independent Colleges and University of New York, Chair of the New York Academy of Sciences, and Vice Chair of the American Council on Education. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of both the Association of American University Presidents and the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served as Chairman of the Board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He holds many honorary degrees and has received many awards in debate, including being named the Outstanding High School Debate Coach of the last 50 years. Mr. Sexton has been a member of the IPPF Advisory Board for the past several years and is an annual sponsor of this competition. United States Army General Wesley K. Clark is a businessman, educator, writer, and commentator. General Clark serves as Chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark & Associates, a strategic consulting firm. He is Chairman of the investment bank Rodman & Renshaw, Co-Chairman of Growth Energy, Senior Fellow at UCLA's Burkle Center for International Relations, Director of International Crisis Group, as well as numerous corporate boards. Mr. Clark has authored 3 books and serves as a member of the Clinton Global Initiative's Energy and Climate Change Advisory Board. General Clark retired a 4-star general after 38 years of service in the United States Army. He graduated first in his class at West Point and completed degrees in philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. While serving in Vietnam, he commanded an infantry company in combat, and he later commanded the battalion, brigade, and division level, and served in a number of significant staff positions, including service as the Director of Strategic Plans and Policy. In his last assignment as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he led NATO forces to victory in Operation Allied Force, saving 1.5 million Albanians from ethnic cleansing. Nice to have you here. Melissa Maxey Wade is Director of Forensics at Emory University, a title she has held since 1972. Ms. Wade has authored more than 250 publications on debate and has coached Emory University to over 20 national championships in policy debate. She's currently Executive Director of the National Debate Project, and she has received every major college coaching award and is among the most respected professionals in her field. Ms. Wade is a longtime member of our IPPF Advisory Board. Scott One has been the Executive Director of the National Forensic League since 2003. He began his career with the NFL as a forensics coach and classroom instructor. Mr. One is a 2-diamond coach and a member of the Key Coach Society of the Barclay Forum for High Schools. During his current tenure as the Executive Director of the NFL, Mr. One is most proud of the advancements the NFL has made in coach education programs, program development, alumni outreach, and communication and cooperation among the leadership of his league. And finally, Mr. Lenny Gale is here with us today, Chairman of the Board of the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues. Mr. Gale is also a founding partner of Massey & Gale, LLP. He's also a former prosecutor in the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. Mr. Gale graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School and magna cum laude from Dartmouth College. For the past year, Mr. Gale has been working full-time as a board chair of the NAUDL. He was a former high school and college debater himself and was voted Debater of the 1980s. He also represented the United States in 1984 in the biennial U.S.-Japanese exchange debates. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our judges. We have 6 judges on our panel today. We have our viewers at home, and those of you who are watching at home, you'll have the opportunity to vote for the winning school. So we'll have a total of 7 votes today. So thank you very much. Congratulations. Have a wonderful debate. Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much. I don't need this. Where do I put it? Okay. Good enough. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We tried everything we could to find a reasonably good panel of judges. This is the best we could do. I'm sorry about that. We'll try harder next year. We'll find the, I don't know what, the debate coach of the millennium or something, as opposed to just the next, several centuries. Everybody ready? Okay, just a couple of things for the panelists and for the contestants. Once again, I've been asked to ask you to make very sure that you are projecting your voice directly to a microphone. People all over the world are watching this, and they want to be able to hear you. And it is apparently something to do with the streaming internet that requires us to speak directly into these microphones. So if you'll be very careful about that, I think people, a lot of people who are trying to watch this, probably including your parents, would appreciate that a lot. So if you would do that for us, we would appreciate it. I will tell you that we will follow the same procedure that we followed in the semifinals, which is you will be given a sort of a general amount of time for the final answering of questions from the judges, as opposed to like these specific 1-minute answers. I'll try to keep the amount of time in which you answer equal, so that it does, the reason for that is it doesn't disrupt the flow of the conversation between the panel and judges quite as much. Other than that, all is the same. Okay? So are we ready to go?
We are.
Okay. We'll have the opening statement of the affirmative for a period of 10 minutes. You're on.
I'd like to begin by thanking the judges, Mr. Gale, Mr. Brewer, General Clark, Ms. Maxie Wade, President Sexton, and Mr. One, Mr. Baker for moderating, as well as NYU and the Bickle Brewer Foundation for hosting this event. Since the dawn of modern civilization, agriculture has been the driving force behind societal development. Without a successful agrarian system, no society can gain wealth or stability, not to mention making progress in the fight against poverty. A quick fix won't work for struggling countries. We've seen temporary aid dispensed as a cause becomes popular, then abandoned as soon as the wandering eye of the media is distracted. It is imperative that we seize the opportunity to foster self-sufficiency in struggling nations. It is our firm belief that just because an individual lives in poverty does not mean that that person is unwilling or incapable of pulling themselves out of their circumstances. It is simply a matter of delivering funding in a timely and effective manner. As the World Bank contends, overall GDP growth originating in agriculture is, on average, at least twice as effective in benefiting the poorest half of a country's population as growth generated in non-agricultural sectors. It is because we firmly agree with this statement that our team proposes a comprehensive agricultural reform program, matching specific crops with specific areas struggling with poverty. If adopted, our community-based agricultural reform plan will help to alleviate poverty around the world as local businesses flourish and international trade is fostered. In addition, our plan has the potential to achieve environmental reparation, improvement of women's status, and the eventual economic independence of nations in the developing world. Specifically, we propose that the United Nations increase funding to the food and agricultural organizations in order to stimulate grassroots non-governmental organizations that focus on research and development of agrarian commodities in poverty-stricken regions. The affirmative plan is a unique one. We provide a shift in the way an aid is considered in global society by focusing on qualitative rather than quantitative change. We gauge the success of our proposal not simply by the amount of money spent, but rather by the true change effected. Unlike typical UN humanitarian assistance, which loses significant funds in overhead spending, our initiative's substantial increase is measured exclusively by the amount of aid which trickles down to those in aid. It's clear that throwing increasing amount of money blindly at blanket proposals isn't effective and isn't aiding those who really need it. Our shift in perspective doesn't perpetuate the failing system, but rather opens our eyes to the true nature of poverty alleviation. By using an NGO-based approach, the affirmative gains the benefits of reducing the inefficiencies of the UN through a more direct approach, the benefits of on-ground specification, and combines these in an approach that suits the benefits of both organizations. These NGOs are essentially stakeholders in poverty. They are looking to see improvements in the lives of the impoverished. Private investors, however, are shareholders and are looking primarily for a profit and cannot focus solely on the impoverished. NGOs are non-profit, but they do need funds to function, and by using the UN for funding, the NGOs can focus all their attention on what they do best, helping the impoverished. The FAO will choose especially effective NGOs, 3 of which are mentioned in our case. Of course, if the organization is not making improvements, the UN can halt funding. The 3 target crops we will emphasize to start out are the cassava for West Africa, the Moringa oleifera tree for South Asia, and the Maya nut tree for the Mayan rainforest. The cassava is a shrub with edible roots. The cassava serves as a major source of calories for 2 out of every 5 Africans and is one of Nigeria's biggest exports, already serving as the primary source of livelihood for thousands of African farmers. Nigeria is an unstable region of Africa. They export oil, but most of the profits trickle up to the governing elite. The cassava is one of the only products that supplements income for the average Nigerian, but recently it has been threatened by a crop disease known as the mosaic disease. It has cost thousands of farmers their livelihoods, making their farming highly unstable. The Integrated Cassava Project is currently funded jointly by the Republic of Nigeria, but mostly by the United States Agency for International Development. This organization encourages farmers to replace their old strains with new strains, as well as to adopt more effective harvesting techniques. Currently, the ICP is on a 4-year funding plan for its prevention campaign, amounting to $17 million in U.S. dollars. Under our plan, the UN will contribute an additional $4.25 million in 2010 and each year thereafter for 10 years. Every 3 years, the UN will assess the percentage of cassava root plants that test positive for any strain of the mosaic virus. If they do not drop from their current levels by a significant measure, funding will be cut. This pattern will be repeated until 2020, when the program will undergo complete reassessment by the FAO. Cultivation of the cassava isn't likely to decrease in the future due to its large share in the Nigerian-Ugandan economy. It will, however, remain subject to the ravages of mosaic disease unless new forms of the cassava are distributed widely. The moringa oleifera tree produces 4 main edible parts: pods, leaves, seeds, and roots. It can also be used to purify water. An NGO known as Trees for Life International works with the moringa tree to create improved sustainable communities. Their approach involves education, training, and providing resources that allow for sustainable communities to develop. The moringa pods are highly valued around the world and can be exported. This is similar to the acai berry, a health food phenomenon and potential export. The organization's total funds for 2008 were $983,328. We propose an increase in the budget of this same amount each year from 2010 to 2020, with a comprehensive evaluation every 3 years carried out by the FAO to determine continued funding eligibility, based on the improvement of health in populations where the moringa is introduced, an increase in the quality of stock, enhancement of crop yields, and other tangible factors. The branch of the program, like the cassava, will undergo complete reassessment by the FAO in 2020. The Maya nut is distributed by an NGO known as the Equilibrium Fund, started by biologist Erica Bowman in 2001. The Maya nut is a tree indigenous to the Mayan rainforest. The nuts it produces contain many vitamins and minerals, and the trees are extremely productive. Also, it helps stop the problem of deforestation in the Mayan rainforest. Local people can get training in the harvesting of the Maya nuts. It fosters economic independence and stimulates the local economy. The Equilibrium Fund assists the people of the region in the crop's cultivation and growth. We propose to increase the budget of the Equilibrium Fund from its current balance of $229,539 by a set amount every year for 10 years, funding a system involving education about growing and harvesting the Maya nut for Native women, planting of more trees, and research into other uses of the Maya nut. The budget will undergo evaluation by the FAO in order to receive continued funding every 3 years, with the goal being to assess how the program has helped to increase crop yields in the areas in which it operates, to analyze the net effect on poverty and other measures. Like the other 2 aspects of this plan, the Equilibrium funding program will be part of the 2020 FAO assessment. Unlike development in other sectors, like manufacturing, agricultural development is intrinsically beneficial to the environment. Especially in the case of the Maya nut, the cultivations of crops can in fact improve regional environmental quality. All of these efforts focus on individual initiative rather than what amounts to poorly allocated handouts. It is easier to bypass government instability, thus aiding people directly through agricultural development. However, similarly self-starting methods, such as loans from the World Bank, simply push nations deeper into debt from which they cannot escape, fostering dependency. Additionally, small-scale NGOs are adaptable to regional problems, ensuring that less money will be lost to misallocated funds. Our case strives to achieve substantiality under the Princeton definition of the word, having a firm basis in reality and being therefore important, meaningful, or considerable. What the people of the struggling nations truly need is a viable economic commodity. Luckily, 3 grow right from the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. We will continue with opening statements with the opening statement of the negative team from Singapore. 10 minutes. You can
Testing.
start when ready.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, judges, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, Team Singapore would like to sincerely thank Bickle and Brewer and New York University for giving us this wonderful opportunity. Let me now begin. In his seminal work, You the People, United Nations, Transitional Administration and State Building, Dr. Simon Chesterman of New York University clearly crystallizes the distinction between humanitarian and developmental aid. Developmental aid targets the chronic causes underlying poverty, while humanitarian aid only tries to alleviate immediate suffering. Hence, the negative finds it odd that affirmative classifies increased funding for agricultural techniques to raise the net income of the poor as part of humanitarian assistance. Despite this conceptual error in comprehending the clash of this debate, let us address their proposal directly. What is our alternative, first of all? We propose infrastructure-based developmental aid. We stand for aid that is targeted not at increased food production, but at building infrastructure like schools, roads, and irrigation facilities. Agrarian-based aid aims to alleviate suffering immediately by increasing food production, but our aid is targeted instead at addressing the chronic long-term problems that underlie poverty. We will provide for local capacity building that is essential for the country to function independently of aid, rather than simply by throwing aid at the problem. We support developmental aid that fits 3 criteria. First, such aid should utilize local manpower and resources as far as possible. Next, aid should be tied to ex-post conditionalities, meaning the government should demonstrate its ability and willingness to comply with standards of governance set by the international community before it receives such aid. Lastly, such aid should be constantly monitored to ensure its proper usage. Even if we assume that these criteria are not wholly met, several differences make developmental aid targeted at infrastructure far superior to the affirmative's agrarian-based aid. And now I'm going to make the case for our model. Having infrastructure funded by donors built in a poor country ensures the people who construct the infrastructure get employment, raising their net income. The completed facilities also provide jobs, be it for workers in factories or teachers in schools. Education provided within such facilities that we build also increases income by upgrading the skills of workers and students. In contrast, the affirmative's policy will destroy the economies of the nations they seek to help. Firstly, there is no guarantee from them that increased food production will benefit the poor of these developing nations, who might still be priced out of the market because of chronic poverty. Secondly, even if we assume that the affirmative manages to benefit the poor somehow, the farmers who are selling the food in turn will still generate less profit because of the lower selling prices. This hurts their income and damages the local agricultural sector. Similarly, encouraging farmers to change crops to the 3 crops they've chosen to identify doesn't generate new jobs directly for a local economy in the same way that opening new factories or building new schools actually does. Indeed, the reason why farmers around the world are unable to commercially market their products is because of a lack of infrastructure. A 2004 study conducted by the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture concluded that none of the communities the ICP, which is focused on cassava, targeted had actually had storage facilities. This meant that while farmers had disease-resistant cassava, they were unable to embark on sizable commercial production and supplement their incomes. Indeed, in the district of Nung Ukana, the benefit-cost ratio for farmers that we saw was for every 91 cents that they were able to gain out of their harvest, they had to put in $1. We find such ratios harmful because farmers suffered losses. This suggests we need to build infrastructure before we start agrarian production. Now, increasing the average income of developing nations gains new significance when we take into account the effects of income on the fragile democracies of many countries. In the essay, What Makes Democracies Endure?, Przeworski et al. Offers a fascinating insight. A democracy can be expected to last an average of 8.5 years in a country with per capita income of under $1,000 per annum, 16 years in one between $1,000 and $2,000, 30 years with one between $2,000 and $4,000, and about 100 years between $4,000 and $6,000. Above $6,000, democracies are impregnable. They are certain to survive come hell or high water. It is infrastructure-based aid which catalyzes the formation of key institutions and services that can slowly build a stable humanitarian situation, layering on concrete development. Indeed, according to the UN Development Programme, poverty in Uganda was cut from 56% in 1992 to 31% in 2005. This decrease was entirely due to the construction of new infrastructure like factories and hospitals, not through an increase in food production. Worse still, the affirmatives policy serves to permanently entrench developing nations' unsustainable and harmful overdependence on primary agriculture. According to economist Dambisa Moyo in her seminal 2010 book, Dede, Africa's failure to develop in terms of gross domestic product growth is primarily because of what she terms as the resource trap. These nations being dependent on cheap primary exports like agriculture that prevents them from diversifying into far more productive and sustainable industries like manufactured goods and services. From an economic perspective, the Singer-Prebisch hypothesis, an integral part of current economic development theory, states that countries which specialize in agriculture inevitably lose out over time, as the price of agricultural exports decreases drastically relative to the price of manufactured goods. This means agricultural countries produce goods that brings them less and less profit. Lastly, according to the WTO, cassava, maya nut, and Moringa oleifera currently don't even have an appreciable share in the agricultural trade market globally, as demand for these crops from developed countries is so small as to be negligible. This means the crops they advocate aren't even viable export crops in the very first place. This has hugely deleterious consequences. According to prominent economic historian Nicholas Tarling, the only way developing countries can grow is to create a sustainable and significant export market, as these countries' domestic markets are too small to support growth. The affirmative promotes crops that can't contribute to this export market and which will be worthless in the long run, even if they could. Let's head on to the issue of monitoring use of infrastructure-based aid. We think it's far more feasible than with affirmatives agrarian aid. This is because the end products of our aid, like hospitals and schools, are more easily observable than the affirmatives, which requires the surveying of vast tracts of land. Infrastructure-based aid creates infrastructure in specific areas and is implemented in distinct stages. The physical results are immediately observable as evidence of its proper use. Agrarian aid, by contrast, is far harder for local agencies to implement in a systematic fashion. Often, agencies tasked with implementing aid policies can claim a lack of results because of acts of God like bad weather or bushfires, making it far easier for them to siphon off resources for themselves. In 1973, the WTO extended a $60 million grant to Angola for the development of its banana industry. After 5 years, there were no signs of increased production. They suspected that the grant had been embezzled at all levels, but they were unable to prove it because Angola claimed that a slightly later monsoon season had destroyed their purported banana fields. Affirmatives' tri-yearly checks exacerbate this problem, for the lack of a constant presence on the ground means that they cannot monitor the day-to-day dispersal of aid and have to rely on the words of local agencies. This means it's far more feasible to ensure sound use of infrastructure-based aid rather than agrarian-based aid. Thirdly, sudden increases in aid are near impossible to deal with efficiently for local agencies, as compared to the increases in the supply of money the UN has to create infrastructure. An increase in aid, especially as large as the affirmative proposes, often puts undue pressure on local agencies working with the UN to dispense that aid hastily and often drastically, disastrously. In the 2000 Mozambique floods, Paul Collier writes in 2007, citing Christian Hanlon from 2002, how local aid redistribution NGOs were under pressure from the Disaster Emergency Committee managed by the UN. In some cases, they had just 48 hours to propose how to spend £3 million from the UN. Often it's hard to even find suitable agencies that can dispense such aid. Similarly, we saw this also 9 months after the 2004 Asian tsunami, when World Vision had spent less than 25% of the $100 million it raised because it couldn't find suitable manpower or expertise to distribute such aid. The same problems plague the NGOs they support, especially since they don't have the vast manpower of the UN or its years of experience and expertise. Infrastructure-based aid does face several challenges. Sometimes it's not always smartly disbursed, sometimes it's wasted wantonly, and much of it can be siphoned off by corruption. But what it embodies, very different from what the affirmative does, is undeniable promise and hope. Unlike agrarian-based aid, such problems are not endemic to our model. The mechanisms of our aid can continue to be improved, but the affirmative's model faces inherent challenges. For the future of humanity, we would choose to fund schools, not farms.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well done, both teams. We'll start now with the cross-examination between the teams portion of the program, and that will begin with a question from the affirmative to the negative.
You support an infrastructure-based aid program. Firstly, does this fall under the distinction you made between humanitarian aid or developmental aid? And secondly, how will you account for the harms often associated with immediate industrialization, for example, environmental degradation?
Firstly, our definition of developmental aid suggests that it aims to satisfy the chronic problem causes of poverty. By creating infrastructure, we're not alleviating poverty in the now, but we're creating factories, roads, and schools that will alleviate poverty in the future by providing people 10 or 20 years down the road with jobs that in the status quo they do not have. We account for the problems of increased industrialization two ways. Firstly, if they want our policies to focus on environmentally friendly forms of industrialization, we are prepared to do so, but we think that damage to a country's environment is often justified by its rate of industrialization because it's able to clean up after itself. We see this in countries like China, which in the status quo are shifting from heavily industrial policies to green technology, but only after they're able to reach a state of development where they can afford this technology in the first place. Either way, we need to give the economy jobs now and in the future, rather than their side of the house, which increases food aid, which might not even really help the poor in the first place.
A question from the negative to the affirmative.
According to development scholar Jonathan Glennie, the major failures of agriculture in developing countries are 90% attributable to the lack of irrigated land and water transport infrastructure. Doesn't this mean that in order to undertake the extensive agricultural reforms that your side proposes, you would first need the infrastructure-based aid that our policy supports?
First of all, the crops that we are proposing are all indigenous crops. That means they're suited to the climate in which they're growing. So therefore, the irrigation problems are not really an issue. And also, most of the crops that we are suggesting, the Mayonet and the Merlinger oleifera, are both very drought resistant, which makes them suitable in areas that usually do not have ability to grow very many crops. And because these are indigenous to the areas, that means they don't need this irrigation, and that it can benefit the farmers without such irrigation.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Okay, taking into account that great civilizations were founded on agriculture, how do you propose developing nations skip this step and go directly to industrialization without a working system for such?
We don't think they're actually skipping this step, given that agriculture is the largest industry in developing countries across Africa and South Asia. What we propose is giving them the space to develop beyond that stage of agriculture being the predominant industry. What we propose is not to hamstring their development by deciding to just focus them on farming technologies and techniques. What we're proposing is infrastructure-based aid, which is going to give them the ability to progress on to secondary and tertiary industries. That's something that your side's policy doesn't account for, and that's why you're not able to truly resolve the issue of poverty. On your side, we find that in fact, what happens with all the aid what happens with all the farming techniques is that you're not able to provide the kind of education which is going to allow people to truly get the jobs that they need, which are going to pay more than the minimum that the farmers get currently. In fact, it's because most people are currently stuck in these jobs that there is an existence of such poverty in these places.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
To feed the poor of developing nations, you need both cheap food and a way of transporting this food to the people that truly need it. Currently, most developing nations don't have the transport network required, a problem which is exacerbated by the large land area of most developing nations. Given this problem, wouldn't you agree that we need to build roads and other infrastructure before we can focus on food production, because the food that you want to produce are not going to get to the people who need it?
This brings us to one of the main distinctions between the two proposals. The affirmative asserts that we create a foundation. We don't skip directly to industrialization and building of infrastructure. The societies simply aren't ready for infrastructure. They're trying to survive. When people are starving day to day, they aren't concentrated on building roads. They're concentrating on getting foods. And once that foundation has been made, from there industrialization should take off, and it will. But before that foundation has been made, we are unable to do so. Furthermore, the issue of transportation is brought up. This is the role that the United Nations play. Our proposal creates a sort of hybrid relationship between non-governmental organizations and the United Nations. The United Nations holds international connections, it holds infrastructure possibilities, and it holds resources that NGOs can't provide. What they can provide is community-based, regional-based plans. Thank you.
Okay. A question from the affirmative To the negative.
Despite the fact that the Stockholm Convention concluded that we must reduce carbon emissions in the next 50 years, your plan essentially opposes putting this off for mass industrialization until it's been determined that we can become more green?
The fact is, you cannot tell these people that we are going to keep you in an agricultural industry forever because we are afraid that we might suffer as a result of environmental harm from your country growing. Firstly, we think a major cause of global degradation has in fact been a developed world in the first place. So you should not begrudge these developing countries the opportunities to grow because you think they will cause environmental harm. In any case, the techniques which allow for industrialization, which is a lot greener, is already present in the forms of renewable, cheap sources of energy, such as using thermal heaters to carry out daily activities like cooking food, for instance. So because these developing countries have a latecomer's advantage in that they can take advantage of techniques of green industrialization which have only been developed rather late, we think it is possible, first of all, to allow for them to industrialize rapidly in a green fashion. And even if this is not completely possible, we think we still have to allow them to industrialize because in the long term, they can still adopt policies which will reverse the damage they have created.
Thank you. And finally, a question from the negative to the affirmative.
In your report, you cite the kiwi fruit and the acai berry as precedents of success in the creation of global markets for newly emergent agricultural products. However, the kiwi fruit required a $120 million campaign on the part of the New Zealand government, and the acai berry rode on the campaigns which also cost millions of dollars from pharmaceutical companies who promoted it as a beauty product. Given that your plan allocates no budgetary space at all for such campaigns, how are you going to create an international market which has demand for these products, given that your policy requires this demand in order for it to be a sustainable one?
Well, as your constructive states, we do not want to drown these NGOs at money at first. We first want to make these impoverished peoples sufficiently independent before we start trying to make an international market. At that point, we can increase funding to the point where you can make it an international market, and also the connections within the United Nations make it more likely that it will survive the international market via making it more able to compete. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank both teams. We have now entered the portion of the debate where our panel will begin to ask some of the questions. And as last time, there will be sort of a timing to keep the times more equal, more so than trying to limit the amount of time you spend answering a question. So just understand the longer you talk, the more I'm likely to shift that to the other side to make sure that we're speaking roughly equal. So don't worry about that. So with that, I have saved you from this as long as I can. I give you the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have questions for these young people? Apparently not. Not so lucky. Anyone wants to start?
For the affirmative. I'm sorry. For the affirmative, the need that you've defined is what exactly?
The need for aid, you mean?
Yeah, what is the need that you attempt? You have a plan
Yes.
for agricultural support, and what is the need that your plan solves?
We argue that there is a moral imperative to act against poverty. We argue that there are developing nations which have perhaps the ideas to enact real change, but not the means by which to enact them. There are also NGOs which could provide sustainable aid, but without centralization and without resources and without funding, they're unable to do so. So that's the connection to the UN. The need, I suppose, poverty, human suffering.
And can you quantify that in some way so that we can then talk a little bit about what level of how your plan will meet the need? How will it alleviate poverty, human suffering, hunger, and to what extent?
Sure. Currently, 1.1 billion people live in abject poverty. And through our plan, it begins in region-specific areas, which are community building. As people start growing these crops, they're able to trade with the other communities in the plan. At that point, once they become sustainable, they don't need to depend on the United Nations anymore. They become self-sufficient. At that point, they can start to trade internationally once they become sufficient and acquired more funding. This will alleviate hunger, certainly. Also, supplementary benefits. It will provide jobs in this sector. It will provide a foundation for industrialization like our opponents propose, but not in the transient form where we're just impounding Western values upon them, in the long-term form that we advocate. Thank you.
So increasing support for these three products, these three crops, will alleviate poverty for the 1.1 billion people who are now suffering and living below the poverty line?
Certainly not. We're not overly idealistic. We understand that poverty is a part of life, it's a part of economy, and it will always exist to an extent. What we can do is alleviate it wherever we can by whatever means we have, and that's what we strive to do.
And to what extent? So to what extent in 10 years will we have alleviated the problem if we follow your plan?
I don't know if I could quantify it for you because you can never account for outside factors, the market and such. But I'd say that certainly in the communities that it's affecting substantially, as well as, I would say substantially.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me.
Yes. Which direction are we going?
I'm going to stick with you for a minute, but there might be some follow-up with you all. I think that some of the issue that we're grappling with are some of the numbers that Mr. Brewer was beginning to cite. One of the claims made by the negative is that their infrastructure project would be observable, large, that it would create some momentum, that it would create interest, that it would create a larger number of jobs. So there's some fairly large claims over here for being able to address the larger issues of poverty in these areas. I think that's where the need for some kind of quantification exists. And I want to go more to the money side of it. In the affirmative opening remarks, we're going to ratchet up a little bit of money here each year because we don't want to flood the NGOs. You've got arguments for why not. And the question is this enough? It seems like a fairly small investment for a fairly small product. And how does that small amount of money, I understand we have a hybrid with the UN, I'm trying to work with the notion of bureaucracy changes, but that small investment seems to more likely yield a small result.
We're looking at investment more, when we're looking at the resolution, substantially increase humanitarian system, we're not looking at primarily as a funding angle, but more as an actual aid angle. We're using a qualitative type of change. And we're looking at it more in the long term. As we take it, I mean, this is just a prototype. These three crops are not the only crops that our plan proposes to help. We're using these crops as a prototype for long-term aid. As soon as they become sufficient, they become part of the international market. And it's basically a paradigm shift in how we're treating aid. If we're not local, if we're large, as our opponents propose, then we can't adjust with immediate change. We can't be responsive. We can't be reactive to immediate problems. Like they talk about natural disasters, if you're on the ground level, you can't account for that. So if we want to make substantial change in poverty, then we need to be local and we need to start small and then look at the long term. And you don't necessarily need large investments to do that.
So you're talking about a lot more crops than just these three?
Yes, as we talked about in our plan, it's a prototype. And as these programs become more successful, we will also incorporate more crops.
So what potential number of crops do you see?
As many as we can receive as far as applications, or not applications.
We also have certain qualifications for what crops would be included. The crops that we've chosen were hand-chosen because of certain qualities that they possess. They're drought-resistant, they're hardy, and they're resistant to certain diseases of the local area. Any sort of crops that fit that qualification, that are indigenous, so they wouldn't infringe on biodiversity, would be implemented in this system.
Yes, sir.
I want to pick up on the humanitarian issue, and I'd like to ask questions to both teams.
Certainly.
So I thought that we were going to be talking about humanitarian assistance. I thought we were going to be worried about people who are under the impact of poverty, who are afflicted by disease, who suffer from malnutrition, who don't have shelter. I've seen them in Bolivia. I've seen them in Angola. I've seen them in other places in Latin America. There's diseases like chagros. There's tremendous environmental problems with miners coming out of the highlands in Bolivia and afflicted by tropical diseases in the lowlands. But neither team has addressed this. So I want to ask the affirmative team why you didn't address and come to grips with humanitarianism, because basically it doesn't help people that you're interested in agriculture for development, but the humanitarian component of development isn't significant. And I want to then turn to the negative and ask why you haven't contrasted development assistance with humanitarian assistance, and whether you believe that you can simply wash away the humanitarian problems through infrastructure development, as you suggested, you will wash away the environmental problems through economic development.
I think logically we go here and then here. I'll just patient a minute longer. We'll get caught up in a second. Go ahead.
That's a very important question. What the negative is trying to do is limit this debate when they're limiting what the scope of humanitarian assistance is. We're focusing on the broader definition of humanitarian assistance, which is long-term, what the people in poverty really need, rather than short-term in response to natural disasters or something. And you talk about malnutrition and hunger, and that's exactly what the affirmative plan initially is going to do. We fund these NGOs that go in there and they work with the people. They see how their society works. They see what the problems are, and they see these people are dying of hunger. They're dying of malnutrition because of unhealthy crops. And we've chosen very healthy, they're very nutritious crops that are suited to the area and will combat this problem of malnutrition and hunger. And they aren't relying at the UN nation for just donations of food. They aren't fostering dependency because they're growing their own food. And eventually this will create an infrastructure and laying the foundation so that they can move into a global market economy and eventually profit. But we're starting with the main problems of malnutrition and hunger.
Do you need the question repeated, or
No, it's
ready to go? Okay, all right.
Okay, on the issue of the definition, we do agree that what you've heard from the affirmative is in fact a proposal for development aid, because the terms development and humanitarian aid are very strict terms with very strict lexicographical definitions. Humanitarian aid is meant for short-term alleviation of immediate problems. Development aid is meant for the creation of infrastructure which tackles the root of these problems. So we do think that the policy we have heard is a bit like a developmental plan. But we think that our developmental plan does in fact tackle many of the problems which are associated with humanitarian aid. You mentioned, for example, diseases like Chagas, diseases like neglected tropical diseases. Well, 11 out of the 13 neglected tropical diseases are caused by an unclean water supply. So when we create supplies for water, supplies for clean water, supplies for irrigation, we tackle all of these as well. And we agree that the lack of homes for many people is a humanitarian problem as well. But the solution to this often comes in developmental, in a long-term form, which alleviates it both now and in the future. So we're a bit confused as to the affirmatives policy, because they say they'll eradicate poverty. But we don't really understand this, because you need to sell these crops to someone if your income is going to increase. They admit already that we are not going to sell this to our domestic market because these people do suffer from chronic poverty. And yet when we tell them, well, you can't sell it to the international market either because there's no demand, they said, well, that's not really our aim. So we don't really know what the affirmatives policy, which looks like development aid, and is going to create a lot of crops, we don't know who these crops are going to be sold to and how they're actually going to get rid of poverty. Because as it seems in the policy, there's a huge market gulf between supply and demand, because no one seems to be willing to purchase these and actually increase the incomes of people in dire poverty. So our developmental assistance does help a lot of problems like neglected tropical diseases. Their policy is not only seems to be developmental in nature, but seems to miss a lot of the fundamental problems which plague developing nations.
Yes, sir.
So let me try to make up some of the time by exploring the negative counter proposal here. A couple of just clarifying questions for me so that I can understand it a little bit better. Do you think that the crops or products, whatever they are sitting, on the edge of some village waiting to be shipped to the outside market? In other words, do you think everything's there ready to go and all that's needed is infrastructure? Or do you think that there's some catalyst that will come from infrastructure that will create the products simultaneously, and there's a demand out there already for them that once the infrastructure and pipeline is there, they'll be pulled through? Connect for me, if you would, supply, demand, and how your infrastructure will develop? Just, what's the premise of your infrastructure argument?
Well, we recognize that the situation in every country is different, so we can't generalize on all countries. However, we do think that infrastructure is a necessary first step before you can begin exporting your crops to the outside world. Without transport facilities to get your crops from your local villages to market areas, there's no way you can sell them. Without storage facilities, there's no way you can keep enough crops to make them commercially viable. If I could, I'd like to draw your attention back to the example we raised in our case, how the policy of affirmative, the International Cassava Project, the farmers that they were targeted did not have enough storage facilities, which was the reason why their crops were not commercially viable.
So that's helpful. Now, so your idea then is that you're gonna just come in and create things like irrigation projects, storage, roads, shipping, those components, and that'll then allow some putative demand in the world market to kind of suck these products out and create the development of them that they're going to try to stimulate? Or do you think that their step is necessary as well as yours?
Well, we do think that our infrastructure must be a first step. Because if you can't even connect up your local supply with the international market in the first place, whether demand exists or not is totally irrelevant. However, we do think that the products of the developing world are not just limited to the three the affirmative has focused on.
Well, they say
produce
that
things
as well. They say that as well.
Agreed.
So, final, I don't want to occupy too much time here, but so this sounds like a fairly massive project to me. And I take it from what you said about all the nations being different, that you're going to do this on a fairly broad scale.
But that's what the UN is currently doing in countries around the world. They're in almost every single
Are you doing
developing
anything
nation around
new?
the world. Sorry?
Are you going to do anything beyond what the UN is doing?
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier in our case, we do not endorse all forms of developmental aid. We'd like to see a change in the sort of aid the UN does. Moving from, apologies, let me just check it. Moving from ex-ante conditionalities, which means that you give them aid and expect them to change, to ex-post conditionalities, which we require you to change before you get the aid. So that's the sort of changes we want to see in the UN. And by and large, we'd rather any
Are you going to
increase in
invest
funds.
any more money in this?
Yeah. By and large,
And how much, and where's it going to come from?
by and large, we think that any increase in UN funds contributed by donor nations, we don't know how much countries are going to be willing to contribute, but any amount they contribute, we think should go to developmental projects. All developmental projects around the world, we think should be prioritized before other forms of aid, including humanitarian aid, because we think that developmental projects are better able to tackle problems of poverty than
So
humanitarian
you would
ones.
build roads in Bolivia before you help the Haitians?
Sorry, beg your pardon, what was that?
I'm just trying to play out what you just said. You said infrastructure projects get prioritized before all humanitarian aid. So that means you would build roads in Bolivia before you help the Haitian earthquake victims.
Yes, we would.
My question is for both teams, I guess. And that would be, could you pinpoint for us an example of implementation based on aid dollars from the UN, okay, to the negative? Can you give us an example of where putting it first was in the best interest of everyone involved? And could you give us an example, not a futuristic example, but an example where you went doing your project first before you worried about some of these infrastructure things, and it was successful?
Who do you want to start?
Well, let's see. Let's go with the affirmative.
Okay. Affirmative? Someone who hasn't answered yet. I guess all three of you have. Anybody?
Okay, well, if you just look even at the U.S.'s history, we first began when the colonizers, well, the modern history, began when colonizers came from Europe, and they started with the agricultural products. If you think back to our early presidents, Thomas Jefferson had a vision of an agrarian economy. This isn't what happened, but we did build on agrarian, which allowed for other industries to develop. That's proving that agriculture lays the foundation that allows for other industries to develop. And this is what we want to see in the areas that are impoverished right now.
Okay.
We actually provided an illustration already in the original constructive when we talked about how the UN Development Program was working in Uganda and was able to cut poverty from 56% in 1992 to 31% in 2005. This statistic was achieved because of the creation of new infrastructure like factories and hospitals, which allowed the poor to get jobs, which allowed them to raise their health standards, and which allowed a reduction in poverty as a result. That's how infrastructure-based aid works to combat poverty from its root.
And also a similar thing was seen in Nigeria. And what happened was that two similar proposals were in the UN at the same time. One was to get rid of malaria through the providing of vaccines, especially for things like tuberculosis and meningitis. And another was for the building of infrastructure in the capital. The one which got passed first was the one to build infrastructure and capital in Lagos, which is Nigeria's capital. And because of that, we saw a massive increase in the standards of living in the area, which meant that by the time it came down for the UN to implement the humanitarian program, they had to scale it down massively, because the problems in Nigeria had decreased so much with the provision of basic infrastructure like water and hospitals that they found they didn't really need that much humanitarian assistance anymore. So that's another example of where one was prioritized and it turned out well.
Let me ask the negative first and then the affirmative. My hypothesis, picking up on the questions in your answers, this is a very country, crop, industry, infrastructure specific decision. We've heard examples from Nigeria, Angola, Uganda. We've got three specific crops. My hypothesis is it's country specific and crop specific and so forth. I'd like you to agree or disagree with the premise, and then if so, tell us how we should evaluate the debate. How do you compare at these high level of generalities, development versus humanitarian aid, if you believe or don't believe that it's so specific a question?
Well, sorry, if I may just clarify something. You're asking us whether our case is based on individual countries?
I'm asking you to agree or disagree with hypothesis that the questions we're asking are at a very high level of generality, and instead whether in fact the reality might be country and crop specific. Do you agree or disagree? And then how do you help us decide how to vote?
We think that, at least on the negative side, that in general, developmental aid is always better for countries around the world. We've given you specific examples of where this has worked in specific countries because that's how programs are conducted. Specific programs allocated to specific countries. So the UNDP works in countries like Nigeria and Uganda, and across the board with several different examples, we've shown you how developmental aid has helped all these countries. So no, we don't think that it's country specific. We think in general, across all countries and across all crops, developmental aid is going to benefit the people far more than the agrarian-based aid that Affirmative has proposed. So we think that we'd like you to judge your vote based on which policy you think better benefits countries around the world, not just specific nations.
Before we go to the affirmative, let me ask you one follow-up. One of the things you said was that there's corruption going on and that it gets taken. Now, surely that's a country-specific question, yes?
We think corruption is endemic in most developing countries around the world. While there's definitely more corruption in some countries and less corruption in others, by and large, it's a problem that plagues most of the developing world. In fact, we've argued that our version of aid, the infrastructure-based aid, solves this universal problem of corruption a lot better because we can see the schools being built and the roads being made. While it's much harder to tell whether the bushfire in Angola was started by people trying to destroy the crops to embezzle the UN out of money or by a short dry spell.
Referring to your original question, I would agree with you tentatively because I think it is country-specific, and it should be. Angola is not the same as Bolivia. Bolivia is not the same as Nigeria. The reason our plan would be successful is because we tailor our plans to the needs of that community, the needs of that nation, and they are different. And by enacting some sweeping proposal to create infrastructure in the world, it would be insolvent because the world doesn't all require the same proposal, the same needs. Different areas require different needs, and that's why individualized NGOs would be more successful, also pairing the centralization of the UN through our hybrid system. But I do agree with you that it's a country-specific sort of situation within the policy, but the ideals, it's a fundamental sort of value debate versus long-term sustainable agricultural growth and massive industrialization, and that's general. That's general.
Can I follow this just a little bit? Why can't we do both sides?
If I may begin?
We would be delighted.
Thank you. Well, it's largely a problem of opportunity cost. I mean, if we had an infinite budget of aid, of course we'd love to fund all humanitarian and all developmental aid programs. So I think the question facing the House today is really, which do we prioritize? Do we prioritize a substantial increase as suggested by the affirmative, or do we prioritize our model, an infrastructure-based increase of developmental aid? So our side's arguing, given the same amount of aid, we would rather our projects, the projects we've highlighted, the infrastructure-based projects, be fulfilled first. And I think presumably affirmative is arguing that they'd rather have their projects, the three specific crops they mentioned,
I
be
want to
fulfilled
push you a
before
minute.
ours.
Their plan, as far as I can see, costs virtually nothing. It's very small. It's nuts and berries and a handful of money a year for 10 years so as to not flood the NGOs. Why can't we do both?
Firstly, there's a problem with them proposing such a small plan because then it really isn't a substantial increase in humanitarian aid as the motion suggests they should propose. But we think there's a reason why, no matter how small the cost is, we will not go with their policy. We think it is actually a bad thing. We mentioned in Ben's speech that in the long run, you're entrenching these agricultural markets. And that is a bad thing, because we gave you economic analysis, which was never really touched, about the fact that these values are going to be decreasing in value over time. In fact, we don't even see a market for them in the current world. So we would rather not do them, even if the cost was zero, because the net result is actually negative. So we think that because it causes active harm, in the long run, we will not do it at all.
And if I may add a bit, I do think it's important to understand the sort of numbers we're dealing with today, even though $4 million in the context of a UN budget might not be a very big number, which is the increase proposed by the affirmative for only one of their projects. In terms of what it could be used to do on the ground, $4 million means the building of at least 10, 20 schools in developing nations like Angola and Rwanda. And so even though the numbers in terms of the entire UN budget are very small, in terms of effects of what they can do on the ground, the $4 million used by affirmative projects could have been done, be better used building more schools and more roads. It might be a small number in a bigger context, but in terms of effects on the ground, it is a very great deal.
Okay. Affirmative?
Okay. So, in a way, our plan it does achieve both. But what would you rather prioritize, building roads or addressing the 800 million people who are starving to death in the world? By implementing this agricultural plan first, by doing it to make the people more sufficient and more independent and not suffering from malnutrition and hunger, you can save people first without having to build roads and incur all sorts of environmental harms. And also, they argue that there's no international market, but there are international markets for all three crops. We wouldn't have picked crops that could not sell. They would leave them just sitting with their own backyards full of food. They obviously have to sell. The moringa pods are valued all around the world, and they've already been sold around the world. And the mina has an internet business that's sold worldwide, as does the cassava. And the cassava can be stored in any condition. So basically, they're trying to make this false analogy that by taking agriculture, we can't ever achieve industrialization, which isn't true. Most grand civilizations almost all grand civilizations started with agriculture. In fact, the U.S. still is largely based on agriculture, especially in the Midwest with the breadbasket. Also, we never really addressed national sovereignty here. The NGO approach that we've suggested works with the countries on an individual basis, with NGOs that are already established within the nations themselves and aren't really invading their national sovereignty, whereas what they're proposing, the governments have to change in order to meet the UN standards, in order to get any money, in order to get any aid. Is that really fair that we deny aid just so they meet the UN's ideals, which might not meet up with the national or cultural ideals? Not at all. Thank you.
So on the affirmative side, you would say that you have to feed a person before you can get them doing other things. Is that your point?
Exactly. Obviously, if someone who is starving to death can't go out and build a road. So it's more important that we address the more
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, my question to the negative is, will their plan help alleviate, to some degree, world hunger?
Yes, it will, because we are not saying that we won't give any humanitarian assistance. Our plan merely says that if you want to increase any amount right now, keep the current amounts of humanitarian assistance, which are already helping these people who are in poverty. But if you want to increase it, you should not increase humanitarian assistance, but developmental assistance instead.
Maybe I misspoke. In this debate, does the negative contend that the affirmative plan will not meet, to some extent, or any extent, the need they've defined?
No, we are saying that the affirmatives plan, firstly, meets the need in the short term, but in the long run entrenches countries into agrarian-based economies, which is horrible for them. Secondly, if you go with our proposal, we help more people with the same dollars. And in the debate about aid, it's about who can best use the aid, and we think it's our side of the house.
So is that your principal disadvantage then, entrenchment? Is that why I should push my ballot the negative's way?
Well, if we accept the affirmative, confining this debate to the places they mentioned earlier, where these are the problems, yes, that would be our principal stance. Our principal rebuttal would be entrenchment.
David, may I ask one more then? Of course. So if that's the principal plan meets need / disadvantage that the negative has for you, would someone like to respond to that for us?
Okay, well, they say the main disad is entrenchment, and that's essentially the opposite of what the affirmatives are trying to achieve. By doing it on a local scale, we're promoting self-sufficiency. We're empowering the impoverished and not saying, oh, well, they're incapable, so we have to continue to just give them everything that they need. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, you know, as I listen to the argument go back and forth, I go back a long way on this, back to my own educational experience, and I remember we've heard the terms of trade argument for a long time. It's been out there forever. We've seen import substitution as a methodology for development. We've seen massive infrastructure projects, building roads, and then cities are swamped by urban immigration. And so somehow in the 1990s, something changed. And countries like Singapore had done it earlier, and some of the Southeast Asian tigers were moving, but something changed. Now, I don't know if we put our finger here in this debate on what's changed. If you want to talk about development, neither side has really mentioned the private sector. And yet if you look at China today, how much UN development assistance went into China? Did the UN go in and build schools and roads in China? And yet China's doing pretty well. So what happened to the private sector in this debate? I'd like both the affirmative and the negative to address the private sector role in development.
Let's go this way first.
Well, firstly, we advocate the use of NGOs, which are part of the private sector. They are nonprofit, yet they still represent private organizations. They don't have governmental interests. They have no ties to any sort of national government and no conflict of interest because they're nonprofit. They don't have shareholders. They don't really care to make a profit. It's a non-government organization, and I think the benefits of having something that's in the private sector is that we're not funding Western financial interests. We're not funding, any sort of nation's agenda, geopolitical agenda. We are funding organizations which are proven to have good intentions, and they're not out to make a profit. They can't. They're non-governmental organizations, nonprofit, and thus we see them as effective.
Now, the reason China was able to develop the way it was because of massive investment into China during a period when it was beginning to develop. Right? That was mostly because of positive animal spirits with regard to the Chinese economy, and because a lot of companies overseas saw fit to invest in it. And also because the Chinese workers had a very strong work ethic at that time, according to some notable writers. The problem with the difference between China and these African economies you're talking about is that sort of willingness to invest in these countries does not exist independently in the private sector today. What we see the UN's role as doing is it's creating the incentive which allows the private companies to have a bit more faith in these African economies or these developing economies to allow for them to invest. Because these countries are so riddled with corruption and they've stagnated for so long that investors really don't see why they want to invest in it. It seems like an unprofitable waste of their money. But what we're doing is that we are changing that perception and we are opening the way for investment to begin to move into these countries. In fact, the shift from import substitution industrialization to export-oriented industrialization happened in the 1990s because a lot of the countries, especially those in Southeast Asia with the 1997 Asian financial crisis, realized after a while that their agricultural industries, which were rife with stuff like tariffs, stuff like protectionism, they were unsustainable, which is why they moved to trying to attract foreign investment to allow for manufacturing sector for things like electronics in Indonesia and Singapore, right? For instance, that's why that shift occurred, because they realized that agricultural import substitution, industrialization was unsustainable. And it is in light of those economic developments that our policy is being instituted to strengthen the exports of these countries, which is what really allowed countries, especially developing countries in the 1990s, to progress from the mire which they were stuck in earlier.
We probably have time for one more series of questions. Would probably really like to start with with the affirmative in case we run out of time. We're a few minutes backwards now on that one. Are there other questions that anyone has? If not, I have one. Anybody? Affirmative. To be honest, this strikes me a little as development versus development light. You guys aren't showing up with lunch. You're showing up with seeds, right? So is this, I mean, when we talk about the plan being humanitarian assistance versus development assistance, it strikes me that they're just two different flavors of development assistance on different levels. Can you explain or describe for me a little bit about what those distinctions are and why they matter?
There is a fundamental distinction between what the affirmative proposes and what the negative proposes. And this, I think, not definitions and statistics, should be what really influences your decision. What the affirmative proposes is a plan of sustainability, a plan which allows the economies of these regions to become self-sufficient. We provide the upstart, and then upon inception, after a few years, after we provide the oversight and ensure that it's working, they become self-sufficient. What the affirmative proposes is a broad, blanket organization of just implementation of infrastructure. The UN has tried this. We've tried just throwing money at huge blanket initiatives, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because not every country is the same. Not every country wants the same things. They haven't addressed national sovereignty at all. How do we know that these nations want to be industrialized? How can we just go in and build roads and build schools? Furthermore, when people are starving, they're less likely to want to have roads than to want to have food. When people are starving, they're not able to go to school because they have to work to get food. Child labor is an issue because of this fact. And by ignoring this fact, we're ignoring the fundamental problem. And by establishing this foundation that we create, we're able to move into supplementary benefits that the negatives plan might provide, such as industrialization.
Folks, we're at about 10 minutes worth of answers each. I think we're at a point where we can move to the final two summary rebuttal statements by both teams. I'm supposed to be talking into this, I'm sorry. So we will do that, and we will start with the final rebuttal statement from the negative, and you have 5 minutes anytime.
The negative still maintains that the affirmative policy today seems largely to be based along developmental aid. But in the spirit of this debate, we'll accept the definition and move on with it. I'm going to show you two things today in this rebuttal speech. Firstly, I'll defend our case against some of the attacks they have raised. Secondly, I'll show you why their case principally cannot succeed, and even if it did, it would be a very terrible thing. So let's go on to the first part of my case, the defense against some of the attacks they made. Now, affirmative attacks in our case have generally been about two things. Firstly, they said that our policy is going to result in environmental degradation. Secondly, they said that people of developing nations aren't ready to move to industrialization yet. So let's go and answer the first point. They told us that our policy would result in environmental degradation. The first thing we told them is that we never said we only stand for the sort of industrialization that destroys a country's environment. Green technology isn't that difficult to achieve, even with the current standards we have in the status quo. Sometimes it's as simple as moving from destructive slash and burn farming to more irrigated farming, which we propose with our infrastructure policies. Sometimes it's as simple as installing carbon filters on the stacks of chimneys, which cost only $100 each. So that's achievable. But even if it wasn't achievable, we've consistently argued that developing nations deserve the right to pollute, because developed nations have done this in the past, and we think it's unfair of them to expect developing nations not to pollute as they are industrializing. And here I'd like to point out a little contradiction we think the affirmative has made in their case. Much of their case has been about giving giving money to local NGOs because they're afraid of imposing international UN ideals on national cultural norms. Yet their criticism of our case is that we do not hold countries to the international ideal of environmentalism. So we ask you, how can both these statements coincide in the same case? Please explain this in your rebuttal speech. Affirmative. So let's go on to the next point. They told us that developing countries are just not ready for it. And we think this is completely untrue. We think that people are always ready to get an education. We think that people are always ready to get a better job. We think people are always ready to move themselves out of poverty no matter what stage of their lives they are in. To say that developing nations aren't ready to move out from poverty is a statement we find rather insulting to the people of the developing nations because we think they are ready and they deserve a chance to move away from the agrarian-based economies which are not sustainable in the long term and towards the industrial policies that have benefited nations like Singapore and China, allowing them to become the powers we see today. So let's go on to my next question on the attack of their side's policy. Now, we told them several things. We told them their policy just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work for a few reasons. Because people who are chronically poor are still going to be chronically poor. And unless you can push the prices of your goods below $1.25 US a day, they're still not going to be able to afford the sort of crops that you suggested. And even if you push the prices of food below that, we think the farmers selling the crops are the ones going to be massively harmed by their policy. We gave you an example of how their own policy, the International Cassava Project, failed fundamentally in Nigeria, instead causing farmers to lose money rather than benefit from the project, because they did not have the storage infrastructure with which to make their products commercially viable. We are the side that wants to put this infrastructure in place because our side of the house is the one that truly cares. They told us that their crops were drought resistant, so our policy of irrigation wasn't really going to help things. I'd first like to point out they've already told us in their own speech that they aren't just talking about these 3 crops, but all the crops around the world, and a vast majority of them do require constant water supplies and irrigation, something provided by our side's policy and model. But more fundamentally, the crops that actually have a large market on the world stage. Now, we're not saying their crops have no market because all crops have a market. The point is just how big is the market? The crops that are staples in the world today, crops like wheat, crops like rice, require intensive irrigation, which can only be brought about by an increase in infrastructure spending like our side proposes. If you truly want countries not just to be able to satisfy their own demand, but to export goods and increase the income of their population, you need to go with our side of the house. From the start of the debate, we've consistently shown you why their policy does not result in income increases for the people of developing nations, and why income increases are fundamental to dealing with the problem of poverty and ensuring that stable democracies are created in countries around the world. If you only ever satisfy production of a single indigenous good that has no market on the international stage, the income of the people within your nation is simply not going to improve. You're entrenching your economy in an agrarian-based economy that is simply not going to work. I'd like to end my speech on this little anecdote. The country of Singapore actually used to grow cassava before the war. We called it tapioca, but we moved away from tapioca really quickly after World War II ended because we realized it just wasn't commercially viable. Now, the only people that eat tapioca in Singapore is on Total Defense Day, when we eat it in memoriam of what our ancestors used to suffer. And we'd like if less people around the world had to do that, and we got more schools and more factories.
The 6 of us stand here today debating arguably the most fundamental issue of the human condition, global poverty. I urge you, judges, to not make your decision based on trivial definitions and what we might see as developmental aid versus humanitarian aid and terms, but rather on who can effect true sustainable change in a world that suffers from global poverty. I'll begin by addressing the issue of humanitarian aid versus developmental aid. It's an issue of short-term versus long-term. We employ a system of long-term aid in order to promote the infrastructure that they promote, but in a timely manner. Firstly, their plan provides a transient approach. It would perhaps work for a little while, but there are socioeconomic inherencies in these societies. That's why they've been in poverty for so long. That's why we need to address the problem, not just the symptoms, by throwing on some roads and building up some schools. We're not addressing the fact that a lot of these governments are corrupt. They need to be addressed specifically, and that the people simply aren't able to survive. Furthermore, they say that their plan would catalyze key institutions. We must realize that these people are starving. Again, they simply don't have the basis. They don't have the basis for an industrialized society. And if they did, then they wouldn't be suffering as they are now. Furthermore, my opponents state that the crops aren't currently used widely. The demand doesn't exist. The fact that they're not currently used widely now isn't really a point because we're proposing a shift in the status quo. Furthermore, the demand doesn't exist because they're not as widely known. Once they become self-sufficient, we can employ advertising campaigns and such. Also, there is a wide market for organic products and, the homegrown initiative. That could be a marketing ploy for these crops once they become self-sufficient. They cite the susceptibility of agriculture. I can't stress to you enough, we are very selective in the crops we choose. They are chosen because they are resistant to disease, resistant to drought. They are palatable, they are nutritious, very specific on the types of crops, and that leads to our success in this plan. We haven't addressed this, but the negative is essentially affirming the resolution. They're proposing a counterplan which works under the UN, provides a substantial increase. They're essentially affirming. That's a point. The negative tries in his final rebuttal to paint the affirmative as nihilistic and that we want to keep people in poverty forever. Certainly not. And in order to properly address this issue, we must consider the harms of industrialization, exploitation of the worker, environmental degradation. It is these harms that would truly hurt third world developing nations, not community-based agriculture, which would provide them opportunities. More harms, national sovereignty. Again, we have no idea that these nations want to be overthrown by Western ideals of industrialization and massive projects of infrastructure. It is undeniable that the moral imperative exists for action on poverty. But what is more important to recognize as is the necessity of sustainable progress. Progress which enables, progress which empowers, progress of independence, and progress for the future. Our proposal maintains the intrinsic values of non-governmental organizations, region-specific, community-based, effective change, which does not breach the lines of sovereignty, while still incurring the benefits of a centralized approach. The large organization of the United Nations provides resources, funding, international connections, which truly could propel these organizations onto the international stage. So this debate has come down to a fundamental issue, fundamental value issue. We can either go with a region-specific approach, which allows the communities to decide for themselves how they want to be sustainable, that allows them to decide for themselves whether or not they want to depend on Western financial interests. Our plan provides choice. It provides a dynamic approach. It provides sustainability. The negative approach really just perpetuates the existing failing system of UN throwing money at blanket proposals. It's not solvent, it would incur harms, and it would damage those in need more than it would help them. And for this, I urge affirmation. Thank you.
We want to thank our teams. That was an outstanding debate. Thank you and congratulations. Job well done. At 7 o'clock tonight, we will have a reception honoring all of our debaters and coaches, followed by a dinner program at 8 p.m. That's at the W, Union Square. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.